Good evening. Welcome to the Ignorant Art School. So my name is Sophia Yadunhao, Director of Cooper Gallery, which is a public art gallery associated with the Duncan College of Art and Design, University of Dundee. So I'm here tonight with my colleagues, Peter Amo and Runa Jack at Cooper Gallery, who will be supporting the smooth running of the event.
Hi there, just want to say hello and just to let you know that we're going to record tonight's event, so feel free to keep your camera on, but if you don't want to be included in any of the recordings or images that we'll share on social media afterwards, you can turn your camera off. But welcome.
Hey everyone, I'm managing the tech for tonight and I'll also be timekeeping, so there'll be points when you'll hear a bit of music coming in, and that's just our way of keeping to time this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Runa and Peter. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us at this event entitled Thinking the Idea of Black Culture Critically, which is the 5th event of our City Curriculum #3 event series, conceived in collaboration with the Department of the Xenogenesis, or DXG, an experiment with pedagogy that emerges from and extends the research practice of the Otolith Group, whose thought-provoking works are currently on show at Cooper Gallery as part of our ongoing project, the Ignorant Art School, 5 Sit-ins Towards Creative Emancipation. So a much anticipated in conversation, tonight's event is a very special. Angelica Saga and Kojo Eshan of the Otolith Group will be joined by esteemed scholar activist, Professor Augustine Gus John, to discuss the transformation of the idea of Black culture in the UK since the 1970s, informed by American Black feminist scholar and literary critic Hortense Spillers' 2006 landmark essay, The Idea of Black Culture, which has been a great inspiration for me personally and for the Ignorant Art School project. So first of all, I would like to welcome the Otolith Group. So many of you might have already met with Angelica and Kojo, but for those who are joining us for the first time tonight, the Otolith Group is an award-winning artist-led collective founded by Angelica Saga and Kojo Eshan in 2002. Their moving image, audio works, performances, and installations are characterized by an engagement with the legacies and the potentialities of diasporic futurisms that explore modes of temporal anomalies, and anthropic inversions and synthetic alienation. Their works had been exhibited worldwide at significant venues and are in the collections of major art museums and public institutions. I'm also thrilled to welcome Professor Augustine Gus John, a renowned scholar and equality and human rights campaigner. Born in Grenada, Professor Gus John has been fighting racism and standing up for Black youth ever since he first arrived in the UK from Grenada in 1964. So his work with other students challenging the racism of Oxford's landlords at that time was instrumental in pushing the government to adopt the Race Relations Act, which outlawed racial discrimination in housing and employment for the first time. In 1968, he founded the Supplementary Schools movement for Black children to counter the racist attitudes and the curriculum they faced and to instill a sense of pride in Black history. So in the 1980s, Professor John became the first Black Director of Education in Britain, and in 1997, he was appointed advisor to former British Home Secretary Jack Straw on race and social inclusion, and in that capacity worked with the civil servants on the Race Relations Amendment Act 2000. In 1999, Professor John co-founded the Communities Empowerment Network, CEN, a charitable organization providing advocacy and the representation for excluded school students and their parents' care. He is now its patron and interim chair. In 2000, Professor John declined a British honour of CBE. Between 2003 and 2007, he evaluated the race equality policy and action plan of every university higher education institute in England, Scotland, and Wales for their respective funding councils, and since then, he has conducted equality audits for a number of universities. In 2008, Professor John co-produced a report with Samina Zahar, commissioned by Arts Council England, entitled Speaking Truth to Power, which looks at the long-term infrastructure of the sector, its strategic thinking and funding criteria. The report still has much relevance today. In 2020, Professor John was listed as one of 100 Great Black Britons. More recently, he advised on and provided analysis of the Stephen McQueen documentary films, Subnormal and Uprising. So Professor Gus John is the author of many publications. His most recent books are Blazing Trails, Stories of a Heroic Generation, and Don't Savage, the Empire Windrush, both published by New Beacon Books in 2023. So that's a long biography, but I just felt I couldn't miss any, inspiring points from this biography. A life stands as an example to all of us in this troubled time. And now just a few notes about the starting point of this event, Hortense Spillers' essay, The Idea of Black Culture. So I'm particularly interested in the propositions Hortense expounds on the idea of Black culture as a critical culture, specifically how she emphasizes culture as a dynamic and fluid practice in which there isn't a singular Black culture, but a plurality of Black cultures engaged in the political and the culture task of emancipation and establishing equity. So whilst acknowledging the problematic impact of the American dream with its gospel of wealth and materialism on the formation of the idea of Black culture, Spiller asserts that we need to urgently return to an idea of Black culture as a critical culture in order to continue the daunting task of emancipation and ecological survival that reaches across the divides of ethnicity and identitarian politics. So that's my preamble. The essay is online, and it's quite a read if you would like to explore more the details of Spiller's ideas around this topic. But now I think I will give the floor to our speakers for this evening to start off from Spiller's idea and to talk about the transformation of the idea of Black culture within the context of Britain. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you to all of our guests who've joined us this evening. And a special thank you to Gus, Augustine, John, for joining us. Actually, Gus is next door in Kojo's study. He's joined us in person this evening, but I couldn't find a camera to sort of be able to compose a scene where visuality and audibility would do the job it's supposed to do. So we are here in the same space, but separated by a wall here. So thank you so much for accepting this invitation, Gus. I'm just going to maybe tell you all a little bit about how we met. So I attended the final event, an event at Goldsmiths College called Burning an Illusion, and it was the findings by the MA students that had been led by a longtime friend and fellow traveller of Gus called Stafford Scott. Stafford is a community activist and a race equality specialist with over 30 years of experience in anti-racist advocacy work, and he's also runs Tottenham Rights, and he started that with Suresh Grover many years ago. Stafford's been working exposing the discriminatory operations of the Metropolitan Police for many years. Stafford and his daughter Kamara Scott were invited by A.L. Wiseman to be guest professors for a year at Forensic Architecture, and they held this event looking at the new crossfire, which, when was the new crossfire?
1981.
1981, to look at how one might compose in this moment various different methodologies to re-look at that moment in this tragic event. I would say just a wonderful thing to see these students actually deal with something that happened in their neighborhood. Also, because of everybody who came, I was aware that Farouk Dundee was there, who was the commissioning editor for Channel 4 when it first started, who actually turned to Channel 4 into a fantastic platform for education. Many people's films were on Channel 4 in the 80s because of Farouk Dundee. Who else was there? Linton Kwesi Johnson, and many people who are actually survivors of the fire, and also Gus. And what was an incredible thing about that event was that it was an intergenerational event. It was the university was turned into a community center for an afternoon. And, it was just a beautiful thing to be with these generations of people I have always respected, who have had a profound influence on actually my life as a child and as a young adult. All Gus's work in education, I remember, transformed my life and transformed my sister's life, in terms of the work he's done in education on anti-racism. It has had a profound effect and something I remember. And that made me realize that we are very lucky, to have figures and people like this who, who are there, who are elders, who are active and who are sharp and who are amazing and still continue the struggle. And so in that sense, I wanted to kind of step out of so I met Gus there, we shared a train ride home and we discussed many things. And actually we moved from politics to internationalism, to the kind of meaning of what Black means these days. Gus, like us, comes from a time where, the term Black was a term that we used in solidarity with each other as Asians and Africans and Caribbeans in response to these racializing terms. We spoke from within a categorization of what Black is, but also against it together. So we talked a lot about that, I remember, and about the kind of Indo-Asian, African, different sort of solidarity movements. And we also spoke about his work as a spiritual guide, as an Orisha. And I think we spoke a little bit about that as well, which was really wonderful. And so it's just a real pleasure to have you here, Gus. And also just to say that we are going to be showing some clips, and yes, I actually was going to say something and I got nervous and I forgot what it was, so I'm going to let Kojo take over now. I'll remember in a minute and then
yeah, thank you for for those introductions, and I'd like to extend a welcome to Gus John. It's a pleasure to have you here. Maybe I'll read one particular quote from Hortense Spillers' essay, and then we can carry that over to the clip we're going to play from Steve McQueen's 2020 film Education, the final film in his cycle of small acts films, which Gus acted as a consultant on. And so that film will act as a kind of a bridge between the era of activism of the 70s and the 80s, and also the present, where many of us are returning to those moments via images and sounds. So we're going to use Steve McQueen's film to travel back and forth between the past and the present. And in so doing, we'll talk both about generational changes and we'll talk about transformational changes. So that's the kind of structure of our conversation. So we have 3 quotes from Hortense Spillers, but I'm going to read the third one. It's at the very end of a typically dense and challenging text by Hortense Spillers. And she writes the following: because it was set aside, Black culture could, by virtue of the very act of discrimination, become culture, insofar as, historically speaking, it was forced to turn its resources of spirit toward negation and critique. But a crisis was at hand. And then maybe I'll just read one more, I can't help it. She says, it is striking that precisely because Black cultures arose in the world of normative violence, coercive labor, and the virtually absolute crush of the everyday struggle for existence, its subjects could dare to imagine a world beyond the coercive technologies of their daily bread. So there she's really talking about the foundation of what we know as Black culture in America, the genesis of a culture that has transformed the world. And so she's speaking in large historical, political, spiritual, epistemological, and ontological terms. And it inspired us to pose the question to ourselves, to ask about the idea of Black culture in Britain today, like how we would conceive that and how we would take the measure of that question, the demands it makes on us and the demands we make upon it. And so we've invited Gus to be in conversation with us. And it's a world historical question. And so in order to focus it, we thought Steve McQueen's work would help us to do that, because Gus was involved in the consultancy around that work, and because Gus was one of the key figures in the movement to challenge the pathologization of Black culture in Britain that operated at the level of education throughout the 60s and the 70s. And because McQueen's film is a contemporary perspective on a historical moment, which gives us the capacity to reflect on that perspective. So Rona, maybe let's play the clip, and then when we come out of the clip, it would be a pleasure to hear Gus reflect a bit upon the film and the meanings around that. Thank you so much. Okay, Gus, it would be a pleasure to hear your thoughts, both about what we've seen and some of your thoughts about the politics and the historical moment of that.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to join you. It's a tremendous pleasure to engage with you in this meeting. That film is very evocative. It reminds me very much. It depicts pretty accurately the struggles that we had in that period throughout the 1960s, way into the 70s, and indeed the 1980s. We need to situate the whole process of assessing children as ESN, educationally subnormal, in a wider process of othering that the country had done ever since, well, long before we got here, even when they were trying to turn back the Empire Windrush on its way to Tilbury in 1948. And that has its origins elsewhere too. What most people don't remember or are not aware of is the fact that the schooling system throughout the Caribbean was constructed by the British. Each one of those places was a British colony run by the Colonial Office. Most of the teachers and head teachers were trained by Britain, if not appointed directly by them. And everything that we learned in those schools was British. As a boy growing up, I knew more Wordsworth and Shelley and Keats and Edgar Allan Poe and God knows what else than the average British child. Okay, so we have to bear that in mind in terms of the process of colonization, the superimposition by Britain of a schooling system that had been constructed in this country, and ask the question, if that is what the British were doing out there, why were they so patently unsuccessful that children coming out of those schools and out of that culture could be considered educationally subnormal? So I mean, that in itself was an indictment of Britain, even before you began to consider what the merits or otherwise of that designation might be. And I think we need to remember what that clip said about us not all being cowhands or people planting yams and reaping bananas is absolutely right. And it's right, not just a fact in itself, but the way in which people were treated. Those who came from a cross-section of the society. There were people who were functionally illiterate, like my father, and like the man in the film. There were people who had been teachers, people who had been primary school head teachers, people who had been postmasters and postmistresses. There were people who ran health clinics. So a wide spectrum of people. Because in those islands, we were not preoccupied with race and ethnicity. We were much more concerned about the class divisions within the society, which themselves were, if you like, a residue of how the society was structured after the abolition of slavery. So we did not think of ourselves as Black. I can't ever remember in the 19 years that I lived in the Caribbean before coming to this country, ever referring to myself or any other person in those islands, Grenada and Trinidad, in my case, as Black. We belong to an African majority, yes. But then, there were also indentured laborers in Trinidad and Guyana particularly, from India, who had been brought there similarly under duress in order to take their place in the plantation system when African enslavement was abolished. So we grew up in that integrated cultural environment where East India met ourselves as Africans in the Caribbean. So the whole process of designating people educationally subnormal had more to do with Britain's racial agenda than with the mental capacity or potential of people coming from the Caribbean. And I think we need to understand that. I mean, one of the things that I say and write about regularly is the failure of the British state to confront the legacy of empire. And the crowning element of that legacy was racism. So we came into a culture of racism within the society, which took many forms. And it is in resistance to that culture that we had to set up our institutions, build our movements like the supplementary school movement and what have you. We never lost our self-belief. And all of those elderly parents, older parents you saw in that room, they are people who came with high aspirations and high ambitions because they were determined that education should be a lever for social mobility, a route to social mobility, and that the aspirations they had for their children should all be fulfilled and delivered in order that those children would not have to go through the same privations that they themselves had suffered. Illiteracy, not on account of having no brains, but on account of the fact that they were denied the opportunity, they were denied the educational entitlement, okay? And the other thing is that they came from a culture, an education and schooling culture, where it did not matter whether you as a parent were illiterate or not. Your high aspirations were matched by the high aspirations that the teachers had for those children. My parents could guarantee, both of them, my mother was semi-literate, but they could guarantee that my primary school teachers had my interests at heart and wanted me to be my best, which thankfully I was. So that although they were not able to supervise my homework or choose books for me or whatever else, those teachers were an anchor in my life. And to this day, I'm grateful to them for what they did for me and everybody else in my particular village. My point, therefore, is this, that the only way to understand that labeling is to understand the role that racism played in the othering of us as colonial subjects, so to speak, who'd come to Britain, and understand within that racism, the role that eugenics played. Because the eugenicists at University College London, Francis Galton, Charles Spearman, and their acolytes, if you like, Hans Eysenck, Arthur Jensen, those people. I mean, they were propounding some really toxic, decidedly racist theories. In the late 60s and 70s, I and others had to campaign against those people, and they were big names in the institutes of psychiatry, and with chairs, professorships in universities and so forth. But their work, Hans Eysenk's work, Arthur Jensen's work, was being used in teacher training around the country. So imagine, as a teacher training to go and teach in these same schools, particularly in urban schools where most Black people settled, you were being taught that you can't expect very much from Black children because they're genetically inferior and therefore won't perform as well as others. And at the same time, the government was endorsing that and reinforcing it by authorizing schools to bus children away from their neighborhoods if their number in any one school exceeded 30% of the overall roll in the school. And we had that happening routinely in the borough of Ealing, Haringey, places like Southall, Bradford, Leicester, and so on. The government authorized that. And the reason for that was, if you have more than 30% of these children who are typically ESN, it would depress the educational outcomes of the rest of the population. And more than that, white parents would get anxious about the fact that there are all of these Black kids in schools impeding their children's learning. So it was a racist project through and through. And that's why we had to rebuild children's confidence by saying to them, never mind what they're telling you in school, you in this supplementary school are performing to the best of your ability. You are not having access to the kind of material that you should, so that you can identify with the cultural products and the creative imagination of people like yourselves. So we got the books, we brought them, we took our own money and purchased those books. And those children were able to get some sense of their own identity in order that they could more confidently affirm the right to belong within the society.
Thank you for situating that moment for us, Gus. That's really that's a powerful insight into part of what's going on, because what it helps us to think is that, firstly, education is being used to suppress aspiration.
Yes.
That means channeling children towards a specific unskilled sector of the workplace. So it's being used to channel children towards unskilled labor. And then secondly, it's also being used to generate a pathological idea of Black culture, which then requires you and your comrades and colleagues to destroy a white British idea of Black culture.
Sure.
To actually abolish it, to contest it at every stage, and then in the ruins of that racist idea to build a new Black culture, and using the supplementary schools as the base from which to build the seeds of an actual Black British culture, because that Black British culture is what is being actively suppressed. So it's the move from, as you say, the generation who do not think of themselves as Black in the Caribbean, to the generation who move to Britain. And we're especially interested in people like us who are born in Britain, born in London.
Mm.
And so you're born into these continual oppressive notions of a Black culture as pathological, as inferior, as insufficient, as inadequate. And so the effort to, on one hand, destroy, and on the other hand, to rebuild is a two-stage process that's ongoing. Could you talk a bit about, you know, because to us it's what we see is it's a socialist idea of Black culture. It's a socialist idea. It's drawing on Walter Rodney, it's drawing on Frantz Fanon, it's drawing on Malcolm X. It's a reading culture. It's a culture of socialist and Pan-Africanist and Afrocentrist texts. Could you talk a bit about?
Sure.
You talked a bit about what the idea of Black culture that was being destroyed. Can you talk a bit about, you know, the kinds of activism that is building a new Black culture really out of existing texts and new texts which are specifically designed for that moment?
No, that's a very, very good question. Hortense Spillers' work is critically important in this respect. Because, you know, the iniquity of what was going on in those schools, which incidentally has continued to this day, we may come on to that later, is that the pathologizing was not done simply in relation to children in schools and their ability and the potential and whatever. The entire family unit, the entire community was being pathologized. The schools talked negatively about child rearing patterns within the Black family. Black parents, whether from the Caribbean or from the continent itself, were considered to be harsh in the punishment of children. They had Victorian values. The domestic scene was considered to be oppressive, okay? And teachers in a sense encourage children to believe that their parents' way of parenting was inimical to their interests, and encourage children to come and bring stories to school about how their parents punish them for not being more attentive to the work or whatever else it may be. So the pathologizing happened at a whole number of levels. And of course, at the level of the policing and the criminalization of young Black people. I worked in Handsworth in Birmingham, as you've noted. I worked in Manchester, and the pettiness with which the police treated young people, and it was punitive. You ride in a bicycle without lights, and you stopped and you're charged. So young people were not allowed to be young and to have the same kinds of infractions as all adolescents do. So the community was picked upon at every possible level. In that same area of Notting Hill where McQueen made his films, I worked at the Metro Youth Club and at a club called the Cryptic One, late 1960s. And as youth workers, every single night, we had to accompany young people leaving the club, either straight to their homes or to the buses, because the police were patrolling around the area to pick them up and criminalize them. It was brutal, you know? So what I'm trying to say is that the whole community was under siege from the state and its apparatuses, all right? Now, what we needed to do, therefore, was to first of all, interpret the society to itself so that we were pointing up to it all of these wrongs that were being done and injustices that were being heaped upon us. And that's the function we continue to perform, interpreting white Britain to itself. But we were also saying to our children, do not internalize these negative and pathological notions that the state and its schools, etc., have of you. Here is what people like yourselves have done in the Caribbean. These are our writers. When we started when John LaRose started his bookshop, New Beacon Books, which published the two books that Sophia was talking about in the end of her introduction, 1966. He was doing that for a very specific reason, because the other publishing houses, Nelson's, Longman's, the only one that you could differentiate was Heinemann's. Heinemann's did this African Writers series and so on. But those others thought that nobody in the society would be interested in anything written by Black people. And because there was not a market for it as far as they were concerned, it was not worth publishing. And so young Black people had no notion, especially given what they were learning in school, what their school libraries had, what the public libraries had on their shelves. They had no notion of the wealth of literature, of knowledge production across the continents, not just in Europe. Yeah. So it was an epistemological question. Where is knowledge produced? Who chooses what they learn and discards the others? Why is this erasure so total and comprehensive? And so the process of inferiorization, which is what we went through, we were being made to be inferior. We came from small societies geographically, but with a global consciousness of ourselves. And then when we came here, we were able to connect, late 1950s, 1960s, we were able to connect with the struggles of people in the United States of America, right? We took heart from what Du Bois and they were doing, from what Garvey had done. We were enormously influenced by the writings of Frantz Fanon and so on. So therefore, we saw ourselves as, if you like, Atlantic people, engaging in a struggle against a racism that had taken particular forms and manifestations, both in the Caribbean and across the Americas. And we were basically saying we can rise up out of all of that. So the negritude movement meant a lot to us. The American Black music movement meant a lot to us. And while we were here trying to hone our own and take our own place within the society, we were sustained by two things. First of all, what we leave, we carry. What we leave, we carry. So we carried our history of resistance, building communities of resistance to the erasure that Spillers writes about. And it is within that crucible that we constructed Caribbean culture. And okay, so we carried that. But then even as we were here, people whom we left behind continued to do that. So when we had our house parties and we christened our children and we had our birthdays and so on, and we had parties in our homes, we looked to Jamaica and Trinidad for soca and for ska and blue beat and that kind of music. And it sustained us. It helped to keep, literally, it helped to keep us sane. You know what I mean? And within all of that, we were still having to struggle against the police trying to say, you're making too much noise, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do the other. So it was a whole revolution, if you like, in terms of the way in which the society was dealing with us and the way we had to find alternative ways of building a local Black culture in that sense.
Thank you, Gus. Wow. I mean, you have covered many things there which are so important, and I remember actually the atmosphere in inner city schools, because I was in one in Camden, Primrose Hill Primary School, and yes, this exact. I mean, my family, my mother and father were quite wild characters and bohemians and quite, let's say, progressive characters, and we didn't really fit into their white image of quiet Indians, not saying a word and not fighting back, at all. So there was this sense that we were crazy, we were from a family where the children were somewhat out of control. And I always remember this terrible fear of social services and of special schools, and this was this kind of sense that you carried madness in you, that you were too loud, that you were weird, that you were strange. So I very much remember the atmosphere. I remember the children who were sent to special schools, and the kind of pathological attachment white British teachers and headmasters and headmistresses and the whole system had to their racism. I mean, my school was a communist school. The teachers were communists, but they had so little understanding of race. They were so attached to what they had understood, they couldn't let go and learn more. It was like these doors were closed. And it was only, in the generosity of Black thinkers and Asian thinkers in actually bothering to interpret white culture to itself and white racism to itself. I mean, this is, I've always seen this as a great act of generosity, in fact, in the kind of Fanonian sense, to expose, this pathology to the kind of oppressor is something that, Hortense is obviously, and many others have written about. But, it makes me think about the kind of ethno-nationalism that kind of has been growing here. I mean, I want to get to the present, you see, because when we think of somebody like John LaRose, who you've worked with, who published, I mean, he was also a great friend of my relative from India, who's called Anand Patwardhan, who you also know.
Yes,
so New Beacon Books has figured very much in my life as well. I actually went to John LaRose's funeral. Probably you were there.
I conducted it.
Oh, right. Okay, of course. That's sorry. We didn't know each other then, but yes, it was a long time ago. Anyway, I must say it was one of the most amazing events I've ever been to in my life. Edward Kamal Brathwaite's poetry was, I thought,
absolutely
incredible. And I learned so much about the worlds that John LaRose had created and been part of, such as the Black Parents Movement, the Black Nurses Movement, and countless others, both in publishing and in sort of activism. He assembled so many different platforms and educational platforms, political platforms, all dedicated to interpreting white racism and describing it back to these institutions and figures, but also in protecting a culture of writing and of various different forms of writing, and publishing. So I'm interested. It is also something about this place that is so lost right now, and I'd like to kind of think about the present in terms of where we are now, with the kind of rise of bizarre forms of ethno-nationalism in Europe, bizarre forms of racism here. I'm not sure if you're aware of the Equiano project, which is it's an absolute horror of, using in Equiano's name, these Black and Asian right-wingers telling us all that racism is just, a fantasy and we should all get over it. I'm interested in, you know, because one realizes that this wealth of political activism and of thinking, figures like you and figures, and, you know, also in terms of Black writing and Asian writing in Britain, goes back 200 years. This country has such a wealth of culture that was born in, you know, in response to this racist horror, and this hasn't happened in the same way in the rest of Europe, you know. And so you know, we still have to keep this history and these affinities alive. It would help, I think, all of us to hear you on, you know, how you are thinking about the present, because obviously you've been, you know, intervening also with sort of, you've also been kind of working against, you know, the kind of forms of racism that the police have instituted against young people. And that has only got worse, you know, now. So I would love, I mean, I learned a lot from reading your brilliant letter to, and generous letter to, essay rather, almost, to the open letter to David Cameron. And since he's here again, I would, you know, how are you thinking?
Well, yes, it's a big question. Perhaps the most tragic thing about Britain, as far as this subject is concerned, is that it does not learn anything. There's no institutional learning taking place. And certainly one would have thought that the Labour Party, for example, when it is in charge of the state, would have taken a lead in repairing what I consider to be the failure to address the legacy of empire. That has not happened. And in fact, one ongoing struggle that we have is to ensure that the organized workers' movement, the trade union movement, for example, remains focused on eliminating racism from within itself. Now, that it isn't doing particularly well either. So where are we at in this moment? I think it is a pretty dangerous moment for a whole variety of reasons. I never thought the day would come when I, alive or dead, would witness a group of people from the Black and global majority in charge of the state in Britain being a darn sight more right-wing than the white predecessors. The combination of not Sadiq Khan, the other one, Sadiq Javid, Suella Braverman, Priti Patel, Kemi Badenoch, God help us, Sunak. The combination of those people is really a disaster for the country. And it is ironic that that constellation is considered to be evidence that Britain is post-racial, and we've got over racism and all of that stuff, so that Cameron could go to Jamaica and tell the Jamaicans, you know, you might be descendants of enslaved Africans, but get over it and let's move on. So the optics of diversity, which is what we see in that Tory cabinet, is considered to be something that defines us all. And you have people like Floella Benjamin and Valerie Amos and those sorts of people parading themselves up Westminster Abbey or St. Paul's Cathedral, wherever it was that this man Charles was crowned. You have them parading themselves, like carrying orbs and scepters and all those sorts of stuff, And that's supposed to be, you know, evidence that Britain has changed, and even at the consecration of a monarch, you have all of these former African slaves being in evidence. I mean, it's optics, and it's very misleading, deeply misleading, because you see, while all of that is happening, the government itself is still brutalizing people who have a right to be here with the Windrush scandal and the rest of it. They're still filling the prisons with too many young Black people whom the schooling system has failed. And we as Black people continue to be represented in all sorts of negative statistics in the country. So I find it alarming that while all of that is going on, there are so many people doing what I call oppressive, the oppressed playing host to the oppressor. The oppressed playing host to the oppressor, and that's happening all around the place. Now, having said that, the two things to be said linking the past with the present. When we first came here, we came with all our cultural attributes and the rest of it, proud of our heritage, proud of our African heritage, and our Caribbean identity. Okay. And that sustained us, and we built our institutions. John arose in the same year that he started New Beacon Books, 1966, as you may remember, started the Caribbean Artist Movement, which was very influential in bringing to the eyes of the nation the fact that these wonderful people, Aubrey Williams, visual artists, theatrical performers, etc., they had the capacity to transform what passed for culture within the society. Yeah. And our children benefited from that. But then even as they absorbed that culture that we had brought and continued to make, they themselves were fashioning a new British identity and British culture. And it is homemade by them, you know, by Black British children, Caribbean, Asian, Chinese. And they operate within that world. The visions that were there from colonialism, which meant that some of us came from the islands of the Caribbean, others came from South Asia, others came from Hong Kong or whatever. All of that has come together in a kind of melting pot, so to speak, within Britain, not just in London, but across the country. And so now we find young creatives from that Black and global majority, as I call it, making work, creating their cultural products, producing knowledge that they are increasingly getting into the mainstream. So that the work I did, as Sophia was mentioning, in 2008 for the Arts Council, when they were looking at sustained theater and issues of identity and aesthetics and so on. That work needed to continue because it's a good frame within which to understand what those young creatives are doing and why the Arts Council itself should ensure that these established bodies create space for them to give expression to their cultural productions and so on. So I'm hopeful, in spite of all of those wretched people I talked about earlier at the seat of government, right? I'm hopeful. I derive hope from what these young people are doing across ethnic divisions, across divisions of wealth and privilege and what have you. And I believe that they would hand on stuff to their own children, which is a sort of a kind of an anti-racist, anti-establishment construction of their own realities, because what I hope I am doing as a person who has been doing this kind of work since 1964 is providing those young people with tools for analysis, tools for understanding, and tools for action, so that the praxis results in the sort of culture and cultural productions, etc., which could help them shape the future that they want, a future that's not beset by all of these fractures within the society and all of these racisms that the society keeps generating.
Yes, thank you. The thing is that I really sense we have to come together again in the same way that we did in the 60s and like we did in the 60s and 70s, because I have the terrible sense that the very idea of decolonizing, the very idea of naming racism and naming the exploitation and violence and brutality that has only become worse in this, not only in the UK but globally. I think that the very critique of colonialism now is being treated, that various different institutions and governments and think tanks want to silence it.
Yes.
You know,
Yes.
it is absolutely, we need another strategy. We need another way, because otherwise they are just using the idea of trauma to, engage people. And trauma comes to us in parts. Trauma comes in parts from this event, from that event in history, but it doesn't tell history, and it is, we have to actually think about history over trauma right now, I think. So we need to keep strategizing. But we have a question. Shall we move to questions now?
Sure.
I think it would be great.
Yeah, should we Peter, could you read out Ranjana's question?
Or maybe Ranjana could read it out.
Yeah, or Ranjana herself could read it out if she's comfortable doing that.
Absolutely.
Hi, Ranjana.
There, nice to see you all. Okay, since I've written it down, I'll just read what I've written.
Great.
So first of all, I was saying thank you, everyone, and especially Gus, for giving us so much insight into the histories that we sometimes read purely as theory today. And for me, it's particularly thrilling because I was training as a teacher when all of you were doing your work, and it was always inspiring and so helpful.
Thank you.
So with regard to Hortense Spillers' paper, I'm very interested to know what you think, Gus, about the demarcation that she makes between Afrocentrism and Black culture of the African diaspora, if I've understood this correctly. She speaks of the problem of Afrocentric theory when emphasized as opposite to Eurocentrism, emphasized as that, having the effect of collapsing the differences between African cultures of the continent and the Black cultures of the diaspora with their own varieties and specificities. So where do you feel that argument leaves us in relation to the nurturing that we can obtain from critical engagement with the African continental philosophies and creativities and ways of being? I've looked at Yoruba ideas, for example, and I think there's so much relevance there.
Indeed. It's interesting that you should say that, Ranjana, because a couple of days ago, I spoke with two other colleagues at the Tabernacle in West London, where we were looking at African spirituality, from Egypt to West Africa to North Africa and so on. And I entitled my paper, African Spirituality, erasure and the imperative to decolonize Christianity, okay? I believe decolonizing Christianity is a kind of oxymoron. I won't go there, but but your question is quite apt. Let me say this. Afrocentrism, it really does depend on how you define it and where you set its boundaries, really. Because there is a very real sense in which the experiences of people who were extracted from the continent, the global African diaspora, in other words, have departed to a large extent from those same African philosophical and spiritual roots that you're actually talking about. Christianity has run a coach and horses through all of that stuff to a very large extent. But there are pockets of African retentions, as you know, in places like Cuba, Haiti, the Caribbean itself, the Ifa tradition and the Orisha tradition, which is expanding really in that region. It seems to me that if one is going to counterpose Eurocentrism and if you like Afrocentrism, you've got to do something else too, because it's not only about spirituality, it is also about how capitalism continues to impact upon the lives of both people in Europe and in Africa. You can't have a commitment, for example, to African liberation unless you are very clear about human liberation, right? And how does human liberation relate to issues of the cosmology, the spiritual side of our lives and our balance with the universe? And how do you begin to interpret that and situate it in the various traditions within the continent? Because there's a huge homogeneity there, and when if you believe that somehow or other the challenge we have is to determine how we are in the world, what is the state of my being in the world, yeah, then you can't ignore the divisions of gender and class and all of that stuff. Never mind the contortions of ethnic nationalities and so on. You can't ignore all of that and suggest that there is some unifying force called Afrocentricity. So it's a complex issue, because the extent to which Europeanism has infiltrated and displaced quite a lot of what we would consider to be necessary, and attention to African philosophy and philosophical traditions, the way that relates to cosmology, to our ontology. Unless we focused upon that, we simply, in a very crude kind of way, polarizing East and West, North and South, global North, etc., in a way that's not particularly helpful.
Thank you.
I think there's another question here from Nicola. Nicola, would you like to read this directly? Would you like to put your camera on and read this?
I can also read it out if that's preferable.
We can also read it out if that's preferable, yeah. But I think it makes for a more dynamic engagement to actually see you. But if you're happy for us to read it out, I guess you are. So do you want to read it, Peter, or shall I?
Up to you. I'm happy to.
Okay.
Yeah. Right. Nicholas says, excuse me, sorry. Nicholas says, I have a few potential questions. Do you think it's the responsibility of all Black/mixed artists to create work from that at least acknowledges racism? 2, Gus, after dedicating so many decades of your life to breaking down racism in our culture, what is the baton you hope to pass on? What is the next important thing we all need to do to make the world more fair for everyone? And 3, to everyone, do you believe it's possible to live in a UK free of racism? So three different questions to tackle, maybe at different moments.
Well, let's see what Kojo and Anjali wants to say about living in the UK free of racism. Is it possible? Is it within our sights? Would it happen in my lifetime?
No.
I probably have less lifetime left than yourselves.
Yeah. Maybe not, maybe not. You seem very strong, and we admire that. But I don't think so. I think I think it's now endemic, structural, and actually it's not even about racism anymore. It's actually graduated to a global form of techno-feudalism, where race and identitarianism and the kind of various different identities are being set up against each other in order to produce chaos and violence and brutality. So I don't think it is possible to live in a UK at the moment free of racism. I am aware, though, how fast things change when I do believe that it's possible to completely transform, the world within a decade. I mean, I think it is sometimes, it could be possible that we do see some change. We do see a change, but I think we have to be very aware that this is not just about the UK. This is a globally networked, very efficient and now techno-feudal, technological weapon that we are at war with. So, and when it comes to do I think it's the responsibility of all Black mixed artists to create work that at least acknowledges race and racism? I don't think that I mean, as an artist, I'm more interested, I would say, in finding ways to complicate and explore aesthetics and sensitizations to worlds and ways of thinking that racists and racism would like to keep us apart from, right? So we just respond as Black artists or just respond as Asian artists producing representational work that, gives us an OBE or something like that. No, I'm not interested in giving things away that easily. I think art allows us to unveil invisible worlds and also to complicate and think on a deeper level about not just the categories that have been produced and the enclosures that have been produced, but alongside that, our struggles and our communities. I'm not sure if I'm making any sense. It's a big question. Kojo might want to answer.
I think, for us, racism is not a question of psychology. It's not a question of behavior. It's a question of the economic structure of this country. And this is a country built and structured around enslavement in the Barbados, and then throughout the Caribbean. This is a country structured around economic extraction in India and throughout the continent. It's a country, an empire structured around compensated emancipation, which effectively set up this country. So the question of race for us is inextricable from the question of capitalism, and inextricable from the question of the economic foundations of this country. Therefore, you know, if every individual was no longer racist, the country would still be structured by the capitalist structures of economic extraction, which are themselves racial. So it's that we're interested in, not the first, not so much.
Yes, go on.
Yeah, and as for the other point about the responsibility of all Black and mixed artists to create work that at least acknowledges race/racism, yes, we believe it is that. We believe it is our responsibility to do that, but not to say how we do it. We do not insist on the forms by which that work is being done. Those forms are to be invented. That is the work of artistic invention, to do that work. But yes, artists of color do have a responsibility, but that responsibility is not only pre-existing us, it is in the future. So we can choose the forms that responsibility takes. We can invent those forms. We can define them as we like, in any form we like, far from what appears to be race or racism. That means we can go to Japan and make a film about Fukushima. There are no Black people in Fukushima, but we as Black artists make that work. So it's a Black work, even though there are no Black people in Japan.
There might be a few, but
yes,
I mean,
in other words,
responsible for the Fukushima disaster. Yeah.
Of course,
yeah.
But the point is, we define the potential aesthetic forms of that responsibility, and those forms will challenge whatever you think it is, whatever kind of work it is you think Black artists should be doing. That's the point. And it's the challenge, it's the aesthetic challenge that is what preoccupies us.
Let me try and add a bit to this. First, in relation to the previous question, Stuart Hall famously said, I think it was at least 4 decades or so ago, that race is the modality in which class is lived. Yeah, it's a very powerful statement, and I mean, you could drill down into that for the next hour. So I agree very much with you, Coach, with that we have to understand how racism perpetuates itself, why the society keeps it as systemic and structural, as well as institutional and cultural and personal. Those 4 main manifestations, and therefore how, by keeping it structural and institutional and cultural, you generate other racisms. Yeah. So we're not just talking about racism as, if you like, some kind of abstraction. There are racisms that we have to be confronting all the time. And in as much as there is a symbiotic relationship between culture and politics, what informs our cultural creativity is what's happening around us and the way we interpret the world and events in the world. So therefore, for the Black artist, there are two issues. One, our creative imagination, our creative potential, our creativity cannot be circumscribed by racism or the struggle against racism. Yeah, we are creative agents in our own rights, and in relation to the agenda, the imperative to combat racism and indulge that fundamental instinct for freedom that we all have, in attempting to free ourselves from racism and all its contortions and nastiness, we use art, but it's always that way around, never the other way around, as far as I'm concerned. And consequently, the struggle is to ensure that racism does not prevent us, does not, if you like, displace the space we need to exhibit our creativity. So we have to break down those barriers, and that's at the level, if you like, of ensuring that our political resistance gains expression through the cultural forms that we actually choose. And remember that we are not a homogeneous group of people. I am absolutely astonished at the number of people who still, what's the word I want? They still crave these gongs that the state and the monarchy hand out, OBEs and CBEs and the rest of it all. And many people hone their practice and choose what they do with that as a goal, to get an OBE or an MBE or whatever else it may be. I can't think of anything more ghastly than that. Now, so why am I saying this? I'm saying that there are people who are still wedded to the colonial project. I have stood in gatherings in Nigeria and heard Nigerians say, part of the problem we have here is that the British left, right? They went away and left us to our own devices, or they put neo-colonial leaders in place to protect their interests rather than staying here and protecting their interests themselves. So there are those amongst us who have not decolonized our own minds and still believe that that order and freedom comes with being colonized. There are people like that, and that I'm not just talking about my generation or my parents' generation. I'm talking about young people who have this peculiar notion. And within that, there are contradictions to do with, you know, whether because I'm from Antigua, I am an African. Why should I call myself an African? And that plays out daily amongst young people in our schools, in our playgrounds. Girls being told, you're too black and therefore you're ugly by black boys. I mean, there's a whole issue to do with all of that, which we don't have time to get into this evening. So what I think I'm saying is that we have to understand that people are at different stages in terms of the awareness or even the understanding of how racism works within the society, which is why there are many collaborators. They're collaborating with the monarchy in spite of the nastiness the monarchy gets up to when it comes to respecting Black people's rights. They're collaborating with the state. They're collaborating with the police. And amongst us, there are those who are radical and revolutionary, and I number myself among them. There are those who are reactionary. There are those who are conservative with a small c, and there are those who are just phenomenally backward and reactionary. but that's us in our diversity, right? And those contradictions would be there. We've got to work through them, but do so in a manner that does not create even more conflict and divisions and fractures, so that we have the capacity to grow and stay in the stream of what I call an abundance of hope.
Thank you so much. There's a comment here in the chat that's talking around the question of creativity by Mike, and I'll just read it out. And we've got another question to follow after that. Mike says, in respect to this discussion, the discussion about creativity, I like Ben Ockery's words, who said recently when writing about climate emergency, quote, I want to propose an existential creativity. How do I define it? Is it the creativity wherein nothing should be wasted? It should speak only truth. In it, the truth must be also beauty.
That's a kind of a comment more than a question, right?
Yeah, that's just a comment.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mike. And then maybe let's go to
Donna.
Donna's question. Yeah,
I can read it out if you like, Peter.
Perfect.
Donna says, and hi, Donna. I wonder if you could speak to the ambiguities and paradoxes that existed amongst those who came from the Caribbean diaspora to England in the 1950s and 1960s. For example, she says, my aunt came from Jamaica to England in the 1950s and was more British than the British. She believed that independence was the worst thing that could ever happen to Jamaica. Yet she always spoke about the racism that she experienced in England with a lot of bitterness. I imagine she felt betrayed in some sense. She had embraced Britishness, but she had been rejected by those she venerated. It was a bit like unrequited love. Can you speak to this a little bit, she asks?
Well, in fact, I think I began to touch on that in my last set of comments. I think the Windrush scandal really exemplifies what Donna is talking about here. Those people who came in that period, who had a picture of the Queen adorning their living rooms, who would go out of the way to ensure that the police never came to the door, because if the police came to your door, it means that you're being deviant or somebody in your household is being deviant, and that's not the image you wanted to project. The state, in turn, well, it absorbed that and exploited it, so that they made the distinction between these good, older, law-abiding Black people and the wayward children whom we've got to criminalize and all of that sort of stuff. And in the sense, one could understand if people come from that colonial background, they told is the mother country, it is superior in so many ways, and it stands for fairness and justice and all the rest of it. The last thing they expect, therefore, is to come, be totally law-abiding, and yet face the kind of racism that they faced. Discrimination in employment, discrimination in housing, discrimination in the way that the police and the criminal justice system treated them or their offspring. It's enough to drive you mad, you know, and many people did go off their minds because of that. So in one, which is why, you know, I've written papers that I have entitled Generations Betrayed, because that's effectively what it is. Generations betrayed. And you could actually itemize the indices of that betrayal. So the question then is this: if that is the reality of people's existence, what do we actually do about it? It's not enough for individuals to say, well, look, I didn't expect that of Britain, because to not have expected it of Britain means that your minds were totally colonized and you were not in the frame to ask yourself, why are these things happening even in the country that I left before coming here? Why was it that so many people were left penniless when Britain left on the day or night of independence? They give you a flag, they give you an anthem, but they left you as poor as church mice, right? So it's all of those kinds of questions, and therefore I believe that we need to understand how in that early period we organized ourselves against that form of rabid racism and all the oppression that it signified. And we did. We built our institutions. We took to the streets. We drove away the fascists who wanted to walk through our communities, sowing hate with impunity, under the watchful eye of the police. We had to physically drive them away. So my point is that, for me, and it was a story for us then, it is a recipe for the current generation and those to come. We have to have a fundamental belief in the power of collective action to bring about change. And collective action, not just within individual ethnic groups or whatever it is, across divides. Because, as you rightly observed, Kojo, the issue of the economic realities that we face, the capitalist project and all that it does to expand and sustain itself, we have to understand what it is that divides us and what unites us. And on that score, there's a hell of a lot more uniting us than dividing us. And we have to deal with our contradictions, but move ahead with the certainty that if enough of us are concentrated on truth, on ensuring that there is justice, and we collectivize our activities, and in whatever way it is, whether it be through art, through whatever, then we have a chance of putting a dent in what the society has in store for us. And what it means, therefore, is that we have to have faith in independent organization, and not see people like Starmer or Sunak or their equivalents as those that would bring us to a state of nirvana.
Yeah. Yes, thank you for that. Thank you for that response, Gus. Maybe I would just add a word to Donna's question. I think that generation of the 50s and 60s, the Caribbean diaspora that came to England in the 50s and 60s, they are not so dissimilar from the diaspora of West Africa. My parents' generation from Ghana on the west coast of the continent in the 50s and 60s, they were brought up waving the flag on Empire Day. So they were equally formed with the same ambiguities and paradoxes that you describe in your aunt. The question is the later part of your comment, where you talk about her combination of in a way an unrequited love affair which resulted in bitterness and betrayal. The question is what you do with that disappointment, with that disillusionment and that disconsolation and that despair, actually. What it is that one does with a whole generation who have to fight that struggle with disappointment, which is not only psychic or psychological or temperamental, but is actually directly economic in terms of life chances, ambitions, aspirations, what you do with that. This is the real question. Those generations passed that disappointment on to the next generation, and the next generation, in a way, went into an exile while being there in those cities. You can be in a city and you can exile yourself from that city at the same time. I think the 80s generation was a generation who both claimed Britishness, rejected Britishness, and exiled themselves from Britishness, all in the same breath. That was their response to living with the disappointment and the depression that their parents could not metabolize. This is the question. This is part of the question of culture. Another way of answering this would be to say, given that Gus is describing the entire pathologization of the ESN process took place in the 60s and 70s, the question would be, why was it until 2020 that we had to wait to find and to watch a movie about it?
Yes.
So this is the question. This means the cultural processes and practices that allowed us to metabolize these moments were not there. Literature, yes. Drama, yes. But film and television, no. The fact that it took 50 years to get from the actual historical moment of the ESN school and then its subsequent incarnations, the fact that it took until 2020 to make a work that would go out on national television, that tells you that the processes of cultural metabolization are not there. Otherwise, we would see many, many memoirs, we would see many films, many television programs, and they are not there.
Instead of just one.
Yes. So the question is people are still burdened by this this burden of disappointment and shame and anger and rage, and the question of what to do about it is still a burning question.
But having said that, though, Quadro, okay, I take the point that you're making, especially about that 50-year span. But in many ways, the industry, the sector, is experiencing, well, it speaks in troughs, really, you know, works in progress, so to speak, because it's not been enough. But we've had some iconic productions, some iconic products, whether it be Pressure, Burning an Illusion, Blood I Go Run, all of those things, Black's Britannica. I mean, they were all telling part of a story, including the late Menelik Shabaz's one of his later films, The Story of Lovers Rock. So, I mean, there's a whole genre there. We didn't engage as much with the education issue as we did with the policing issue. There's no question about that. But then I believe what that does, what Steve McQueen does, I think, is to open up new vistas and signaling new opportunities for young creatives and filmmakers particularly to examine what is happening now. Because part of the story that you were telling about settlement and disappointment and betrayal and so on has resulted in the implosion we see happening within communities of the grandchildren of those people who came in that period. You know, it's abnormal for young people of that age to be slaughtering one another on the streets in the way that we've witnessed within the last 3 decades in this country. And the country goes on, you know, I mean, regardless. It is as if we could expect that from these Blacks. If it were another ethnic group I think the country would have been much more exercised about it. But they are prepared to call it black on black crime, and as if that in itself is a justification. So let it be, and let's move on. But before we move on, let us make sure that we bring in the most draconian sentencing guidelines. We introduce laws such as joint enterprise, death by association, joint enterprise, guilt by association, and those kinds of things. And you could see a pattern happening from Suss and all of that stuff. Stuart Hall and those folk wrote about muggings, the state, and law and order, policing the crisis. And it was about policing the crisis. The crisis hasn't gone away. And the police have been more militarized. That's the only difference. You know, and the implosion goes on within our communities. So the whole thing shifts. It takes on a different shape. It requires different kinds of responses every decade, or even less than a decade. But at the heart of it is the state, it's systemic racism, and what that does in terms of displacement of people and their aspirations and their life chances and opportunities, and the internalization of trauma. And there's a hell of a lot of that going on within our communities.
But I guess what I was saying about trauma was that can't be the only a resource to act from. There has to be a kind of understanding, like you're saying, of the systemic. I mean, that's what's, you know, the role is to kind of think about history and create you know, works. Or I mean, I agree with all you've said, but my point, I think I just have one more point with Steve McQueen. I mean, it is a shame that you know, you mentioned, you know, Blacks Britannica, Menelik Shabazz, you mentioned all these fantastic filmmakers, and, you know, Black Audio Film Collective, Sankofa, I'd add to that. And, you know, but, you know, these people emerged, you know, during the era of like Farouk Dundee and this kind of network of people in media and, you know, anti-racist struggles, who were making sure, and tricontinental filmmaking, independent filmmaking movements. And, you know, there were platforms and there were that were, you know, fought for where these filmmakers were making films. And now they have turned one person, they create these singular art stars who have kind of power, who are given carte blanche to do anything they want for decades, you know, it feels like. So while I appreciate the Steve McQueen intervention, I prefer, you know, I prefer looking into the mind screen and the worlds of Menelik Shabazz. I prefer to look at the worlds of Black Britannica, made by a Canadian director, I believe, white Canadian director. I prefer to see the thinking spaces of the collective filmmaking project of Sankofa or Black Audio Film Collective. I like to, you know, I want to think about that in relation to Usman Semben or Charles Burnett, or Ritwik Ghatak, or Satyajit Ray, or these great Bangladeshi filmmakers, Rushia Amin in London, in the UK. I mean, you know, there are many worlds in which to climb into and to think about these histories now. And I just wish there was more opportunity for more support for not highly privileged kids with you know, a lot of money to go to school, but for all kinds of people to go to school and to learn about these practices. So independent platforms and independent gatherings to make education an undercommons, as Fred Moten, the African-American philosopher and writer, with his colleague Stefan Ohani, write about, an undercommons.
maybe yeah, thank you. That's a very it's a compelling moment. Maybe yeah, does Vanessa want to read out her question, which will be the final one, or should we read it out?
I can read it if you like.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much.
This question came to my mind within the context of collective action. And so I ask, can you envisage a racial justice, a truly racially equal society under capitalism? Or in beginning this collective action, does reaching this level of justice mean first dismantling all capitalist structures?
So
that's to anyone.
Thank you, Vanessa. It's an important question. In a sense, it's a yes and no answer. Yeah. I believe that more and more effort, action, thought has got to be put into understanding how capitalism works daily in our lives and in our planet, and joining up the dots in relation to all of that stuff. It's not possible anymore, in my view, to focus on racial justice without focusing on climate justice. There are parts of the world where the climate is likely to obliterate people much faster than racism did or continues to do. So I think we need to be conscious of that, and conscious too of the sort of subtle ways in which this, well, not so subtle, but the misunderstood ways in which all of that actually happens. What is the relationship, for example, between the global arms industry and the genocide going on in Gaza and the West Bank right now? How does how is it possible for Britain and the United States to continue in this moment to be arming Israel because Sunak says Israel must win, knowing that there is this genocide going on under our very eyes, as if the death of 6,000 children who have no connection whatsoever with that conflict, except that their lives are being denied, are being slaughtered, and if they don't die from bombs, they die from starvation and thirst. How is it in this world at this time, this could be allowed to go on as if it's like, you know, a storm or a tornado that's passing through the Middle East? It's utterly incredible. So we have to join up those dots, make those connections, and ask ourselves, what does that mean for us as a state, as a nation? What does it mean for the world? And if we could allow that to happen, as we did with Bosnia and Herzegovina and all of that stuff, do we have to expect a cycle like this every decade or whatever, until such time that we're all obliterated? It's a depressing moment in that sense. So we have to understand how capitalism works, and that it won't be dismantled as one big sort of Big Bang kind of event, but we've got to tackle it at all of these various levels in relation to what's happening to the human wastage that there is in the society as a result of all of these Black kids born in this country who are being put into jails and would rot there for many years. Many of them because they've stuck knives into the stomachs of people of their own age group. if we don't believe that as Black people, they have a natural propensity to murder and mayhem, we've got to find structural reasons for that phenomenon, that implosion. So we in other words, we've got to dissect capitalism and understand that it is by doing so and isolating its various manifestations that we begin to address it, and we have more and more to hold states to account. And that means, particularly in our context in this country, not seeing our liberation as depending upon whether the Labour Party is in power or the Conservative Party is in power. We need more independent movements, independent action on the part of different groups within the society and coming together. That's what I meant about organizing collectively across boundaries and divides.
Thank you so much. Yes, it's just absolutely beautiful, most beautiful and powerful, inspiring events ever for Cooper Gallery, for the Ignorant Art School, and thank you for Otolith Group, so beautifully structured, and also all the thoughts from you and from all our audiences, and for all the reflections and the contributions from our audiences. I was thinking if I could summarize something at the end, but I realized I've done 10 pages notes. Just as how I started today when I was trying to summarize the Gus biography, I felt I wanted to read everything out. And every line, every trace of your life deserves to be heard by more people. And again, yet I've made pages and pages of notes. I had a history, I had how history could be related to today. I have a trauma, I have a hope, and I also have this fundamental belief we must have to have this collective action and this collective praxis, and how we could use our hope and to dissect capitalism. We need to understand nuance in all this practice. So I think that's only maybe 10% of what the Otolith Group and the Gus have offered to us. But I just want to say thank you so much. This is one of the aspirations of the Ignorant Art School. So we built up this community. We can come together. We can learn, but also unlearn. Before this session formally started, me and Gus talked about even how to decolonize the imagination. So I'm thinking about when Vanessa asked that question, maybe we don't think about how we can respond to the existing structure. We jump out. We invent other structures, other futures, like what Otolith Group has always done, with all your works and with all your thinking and words and the aesthetics and all the makings. So I think that's perhaps I should just stop here. And I just wanted to express how excited I am. And I wouldn't be able to sleep for another night. I'm very, very sure. With all these beautiful, inspirations. And I'm sure that, my feeling is shared by everybody today, joined us and sharing this moment with us. So thanks again, Professor Gus John and Angelica and Kojo. And thank you very much for everybody to join us. And for next Thursday, we will have a live performance event called the Thinking with Improvisation Critically. The criticality always in the heart of everything we do. But it will be a live event at the Cooper Gallery. We have 4 experimental sound artists and musicians joining us from all over the world. But we also have a Dundee-based musicians and composers contributing to that event. So I hope we will see you again next Thursday. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you, Sophia.
Yeah, thanks, Sophia. Thanks for
Thank you,
putting it
Sophia.
all together and your good energy for bringing us all together again. And thanks to Peter and to Rona for their professional experience and expertise in holding the technological structure for the evening together. And good night to everybody, and thanks for coming along. And most of all, thank you to our esteemed guest, Gus John, for all of his thoughts and ideas and energy and experience and wisdom, which gives us so much to think about and so much to carry forward. And we look forward to seeing some of you in Dundee on Thursday, the 8th.
7th.
Good.
7th.
7th.
9th. 7th.
Next Thursday. Exactly a week today. All right. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah.
Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
Thanks so much.